is the toxic sewer of our karmic consciousness.
I'm Lauren Schiller. Every week on Inflection Point, I talk with women who are changing the status quo. That's Eve Ensler, playwright, activist, and performer. She's determined to put an end to rape culture.
Well, it says that certain men can get away with anything. More often than not, it feels like women are blamed for those sorts of situations rather than the man who's perpetrating it.
And that's Dr. Alison Dahl Crossley of Stanford's Clayman Institute, talking about Roger Ailes. That's just part of our discussion about the state of feminism today. I'm Lauren Schiller. This is Inflection Point. Stay tuned.
He is the toxic sewer of our karmic consciousness.
That's Eve Ensler, playwright, activist, and performer. You may have first heard of her when she debuted in the 90s, the Vagina Monologues, a collection of women's stories. I'm Lauren Schiller, and this is Inflection Point, conversations with women changing the status quo. Since that time, Eve Ensler has used the proceeds from her show, over $100 million and counting, to help local organizations fight violence against women and girls. On September 30th, Eve Ensler published an article in the Huffington Post called The Undeniable Rape Culture of Donald Trump. About a week later, the Access Hollywood tape came out, with Donald Trump sharing his unfiltered feelings about women as sex objects, a tape that is now being adopted as a case study in sexual harassment. I caught up with Eve at the Uncharted Berkeley Festival of Ideas. Eve Ensler, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thrilled to be here.
All right. I just heard you talk at Uncharted at the Berkeley Festival of Ideas, and the topic is similar to what we're going to discuss here. But one of the things that you said that really stood out to me is that violence against women is not actually a women's issue. And that just really struck me because the people who have really taken up the banner, to prevent violence against women, to stop it, are women.
That's because we're so generous, and we get in there to fix things and rescue things and make things work when they're not working. But in fact, we're not raping ourselves. We're not beating ourselves. We're not harassing ourselves. So there's this irony in all the years of work we've been doing that we've been working to end violence against ourselves when we're not the people perpetuating it. And I think I've always felt in my heart of hearts that until men make this their central issue, making connection with women and intimacy with women and consensual sex with women, making a world where women are equal and cherishing that world and respecting that world. Until men are doing that, how is it going to change? Unless we isolate ourselves on some huge island and call it a day. So part of what I think this whole Trump rape culture reveal, which it is, it's a big reveal of what the underpinnings of the whole culture are, is a call, a moment, a tipping point moment for men to rise up and declare they are not Donald Trump. They are indeed going to bring in a new value, a new vision, a new idea of what manhood is and what it means to live in a world where women are safe and free.
And we have seen that kind of reaction.
Mm-hmm.
We have heard men talking about that. There was an article just in the New York Times. Jared Yates Sexton was writing about his growing up and being told, don't cry like a girl, don't be like a girl, creating this kind of fissure between boys and girls, and how he thinks of that as a toxic male culture. But we've also seen things like, let's repeal the 19th Amendment. So going completely the opposite direction. So what do you think the chances are that this message from Trump is doing more good than harm?
I think we're at a critical mass, a tipping point moment. I think you will see extremes in both directions, right? I mean, I think that's part of what the birth of a new consciousness looks at. It's never clean. It's always messy. So of course we're going to have the patriarchs and the terrified ones and the ones that want to hold on to the world as they know it, fighting for their life, to clutch to what's familiar. But I think what needs to happen now is we need like a Marshall Plan. Like we need a huge network of men who are breaking the silence, telling their stories, standing up to create a new idea of what it means to be a man in our culture. And I think we're seeing sports guys coming forward saying this isn't locker room culture. We're seeing people like Kevin Powell and Luke Harris and Dallas Goldtooth and George Lipsitz, who are men who are standing up and saying, I am working on myself as much as anything to be a feminist, to be awake to gender inequality, to be awake to violence against women.
And how much of, this whole conversation around locker room talk, and I'm putting that in quotes, is clearly an indicator of the actions as well. It's not just words like Trump is trying to say, oh, it's just words. But in the words, his use of euphemism for the vagina, the P word, and all of the other euphemisms that are out there, and there are probably over 100. Do you think that you are the creator of the Vagina Monologues. Do you think that creating different names for that body part is a way of actually disconnecting from a woman as a person as opposed to...
Oh, you mean objectifying it?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I just want to go back to the locker room thing. When has Donald Trump ever been in a locker room? He's in golf houses, first of all. So he kind of implicated all middle class and working class people in his statement. He's never been in a locker room in his life, by the way, just for the record. But second of all, I think when people say there's such a thing as locker room banter, that's like saying we can throw racist words around and they don't have any consequence. Language matters. If I know anything from writing the Vagina Monologues, the fact that women could declare and talk openly about their vaginas, for example, having agency over them without shame, without guilt, without self-recrimination, was radicalizing, just saying the word. So the opposite is also true. When you denigrate it, when you put down a vagina, when you call it a dirty name, when you make it something degraded, it has equal impact. And part of what the struggle, I think, for women's liberation of our bodies and our beings has been is to know our vulvas, to know our clitoris, to know our vaginas, to know them and look at them and feel them and have them and know we're connected to them. But every time a man says a degrading thing against a woman's genitals, what you have to do as a woman is separate your own self from it so you won't be harmed, and that further fragments you and further disassociates you from your body. So women need to have that language. It's our language. Nobody else gets to use that language but us, as far as I'm concerned, unless you're in a consenting situation where you've agreed on the terms. But men don't get to use any words about our language except language of respect, of awe, of wonder, of worship. That's fine. Any of that language is totally acceptable.
Okay, this is going to sound like kind of a strange connection, but I heard you talking on Being with Krista Tippett about the treatments that you had for your cancer. And you talked about the poison as medicine, that you had to think about the chemotherapy that was going into your body as being medicine, and even though it was poison. And I was just thinking about what Trump is doing and this conversation that is being raised and wondering, is he the poison?
Oh, he definitely is. He is the toxic sewer of our karmic consciousness, right? He is years of metastasized racism. He is years of immigrant bashing. He is years of a two-party system that has failed us. He is years of widespread misogyny. We can go down the list, and all of it has now bubbled to the surface, which can and could be a very good thing. It could actually mean we have met the maker and the maker is us. And we now have to look at history, core roots of things. How did we get here? Whether it's looking at the history of slavery that brought us to the kind of police shootings and brutality towards Black people in this country, whether it's the history of the Iraq War and the bombing of innocent people that brought us to a state where people around the world despise this country and want to hurt us, whether it's a history of ongoing denigration and degradation of women. We have to look at a history, and then we have to really be willing to be in discourse with each other to say, okay, we're here. We see that the problem is here. It's no longer deniable. I've never heard this many people in my entire life be talking about violence against women, or be talking about out and out racism, or be talking about denigration of immigrants, or we can go down the list. So in a way, it's that Chinese phrase that crisis is opportunity. This could be the door opening, the window opening. And I think we've got to see it as such. And we've got to do everything in our power now not to let that window close again, and not to let this go back under the surface and pretend that we don't have a sewage system of toxic karmic violations that we have to deal with.
So what do you think it will take to keep this movement going? I mean, there's so much outcry, and that, and next week there's going to be something else on some other topic, but this has been ongoing. It's not going to stop going. So how do we keep the energy level up so that people continue to pay attention to it and do something about it?
Well, I think all of our movements, whether they be Black Lives Matter or 1 Billion Rising or movements that are working for climate change, whether we can go down the list, everybody is doing amazing work. What we have to do is understand that we need to be doing this together, and that we need to join forces and understand we are fighting one story, which is neoliberal capitalism, racist, patriarchal, earth-hating reality, culture. And if we understand that we're in one story, then we begin to have power to be having intersectional dialogues wherever we go. So we're looking at gender and race over here. We're looking at the treatment of the earth and the treatment of women's bodies over here. We're looking at, and that's number one, like bringing it into the discourse over and over. But then there's also, what do we want? What is the world we want? And to really begin to have the time to imagine together and then begin to fight for it. For example, in 1 Billion Rising this year, we are focusing on the solidarity against the exploitation of women, and in particular looking at the situation of women workers in this country, the amount of insane violence at the workplace women are facing, the lack of a fair wage, the lack of pay equity, the lack of Medicare that goes for women workers. So what's happening is women worker groups all across the country are coming together to say, how do we create an agenda of demands and a coalition of working women across the country that in the first 100 days of the next election are going to put forward that agenda. I think every group has to be doing that now and really saying, okay, and I think that this reveal of rape culture means that every mother, every father, every school teacher has to know that the younger we begin to educate our boys and girls about what is intimacy, what is safe sex, what is consent, what is that? As I said today, we're a prudish nation that's completely over-sexualized. And neither one of those is a good place to be. What we need to be is healthy and loving and intimate around our sexuality. And if we pretend that if we don't talk about sex, boys and girls are going to grow up to know it, we have clearly been shown that is not the case. We need to have real ways of opening the dialogue with our youth. And I'm talking at a young age where pornography is available to 6-year-olds now. So we have to be making the opposite available so that people in the young person's mind, they grow up to say sex is beautiful. Sex is a wonderful thing. This is how we do it. It's about consent. It's about going slow. It's about respect. It's about asking questions. It's about being invited. And I think if we teach people that at a young age, then they won't grow up to be perpetrators. But if people are in the dark, they're going to continue to create this kind of aggressive ignorance, where boys jump on girls because they don't know what they're doing. Girls think it's awful. And then the cycle of sexual misery begins.
Well, we probably have a couple of decades to sort of work our way through who's already on the planet and who has been raised in a different kind of a culture. I have read that if Hillary Clinton gets elected, that it will actually create more misogyny. Have you heard this? What do you think about this?
I'm trying not to project too far into the future because projection usually, unless we have a vivid imagination full of light, can often get very dark. The misogynists are not going to die easy. They're not going to go easy. I mean, I think if anything, we're seeing the last, hopefully, I dream it's always the last, but certainly the gasping breath of the dying racist patriarchy. And I think, think about it when a monster or when a dragon dies. It's the last gasp that is often a very fatal one. So we have to know that those who have privilege and those who have power and those, whether they're white people or whether they're men, they're not going to give up that power easily. But I think there are a lot of people showing that they are willing to birth a new world and evolve a new consciousness. And I trust those people. And those are the only people I can focus on. You know, I always go back to Fidel Castro saying you only need 10% of the people to have a revolution. You know, you don't need all the people, you need 10%, but those people have to be a completely committed 10%. And if we get 10% of the people of this world who are committed to a racist, free, sexist-free, earth-loving, you know, culture where workers are respected and nurses are respected and immigrants are respected, and where we want to embrace each other, where we don't put down any group, where we honor this disabled, we can go down the list. If there's 10% of us who are absolutely committed to that and committed to love, I think things will radically change.
Do you think that that is how we bring the other 90%, or maybe let's just say 80% along with
In
us?
a way I do, because, you know, one of the things we forget is that when there is love and when there is the environment of connectedness, there is often pleasure. There's often a kind of ecstatic feeling around things. And I think people are drawn to the ecstasy. People are drawn to pleasure. People are drawn to love. So part of it is like we have to create an experience that other people can't help themselves. I've seen that in 1 Billion Rising, when women rise, you know, on February 14th and dance against violence against women in various contexts around the world. And this is a great story in the Philippines. The workers were protesting treatment in a factory, and they were dancing outside the factory. And there were a lot of police officers who were originally very violent and aggressive. But as they danced, the police started to dance with them, because the energy of their dancing was so attractive, and it was like a gravitational pull towards celebration, towards connection, towards love. And I think that to me is a great metaphor. We have to increase our light, increase what is possible, increase a vision of a world we want to live in so people have an alternative. And rather than being against people, let's be for this world.
Well, that kind of disruption is so the opposite picture of the angry feminist marching down the street with the protest sign. And, you know, the thing that gets so many people angry also.
But
dancing.
You know, dancing.
Why not?
I think we have our time. I think there are times when you have, I bless my angry feminist sisters, of which I was one early on. You have to break through any repression. You need anger. It's impossible to do it. But I think there's many ways to go at it. Do you know? I think you have anger at some moments, you have defiance at some moments, you have serious resistance, and then you have celebration at other moments, and you have pleasure at other moments, and you have wisdom at other moments, you have poetry at other moments. I mean, there are all these art forms and ways of opening and expanding consciousness, and I think we have to pull on all of them.
We're going to take a short break from our conversation with Eve Ensler, playwright, activist, and performer. Stick around, because we'll be right back. Welcome back to Inflection Point. I'm Lauren Schiller. Our guest today is Eve Ensler. She's a performer, a playwright, and an activist. The Vagina Monologues, let's just go back to that for a second, because that, as far as your work for the last 20 years, as best I can understand, you made a decision early on to use the proceeds from that to fund your work, basically, which to date, basically, right? It's funded 1 Billion Rising.
Well, where the money from the Vagina Monologues goes, is it goes to local groups. So let's say, for example, you put your the play on in Alabama, in a small town in Alabama. Whatever money you raise from that play goes to your local group. So you use the play as a fundraiser, whatever you raise, and you get the play for free during a certain period of time of the year. So that, over the course of the years, as well as other money we've raised that goes to groups around the world, I think we've raised probably $100 million that has gone to local groups everywhere. But what's wonderful about it is the activists in each area who do the play, whether they're on colleges or in communities, they are the catalyst, and they are directing those productions to serve their community. So it's locally based.
So that's wonderful. And that's a source of funding that they never would have otherwise seen, and a source of support. And so I have to wonder, was there ever a point when you thought, I don't think I'm going to do this play, or like you must have hit. You mean
do that anymore?
No. When you first started it, just the thinking of, this is radical. What's this going to be for my career? Should I put this out there in the world, the Vagina Monologues? Because if you hadn't, things could have been very different today.
Well, let's put it this way. I was always a pretty radical playwright. I was always writing about issues nobody wanted to deal with, from nuclear war to homeless women. We can do the list. But when I did the Vagina Monologues, there was a level of terror. It was scary. It was scary just breaking that silence at the beginning. But I also felt, because, when I did the original interviews, which I then turned into a fictional piece, I heard so much pain in women. Sort of like all the stories that are coming out around Trump. Like, I've heard that now for 20 years, every week of my life. There was so much pain. There was so much suffering. There was so much denial. There was so much suppression of people's stories and people's experiences that at a certain point, it was like, you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice. You have to tell these stories. And it was way beyond anything having to do with me. It was being in the service of my sisters and being in connection to my sisters who didn't have a platform.
And this is well before social media was a thing. Well before we had the opportunity for thousands of women to come out and say what their stories are. And so you were able to give that a voice.
Yeah. And what was amazing is that at the end of every show, when I initially did the show, women would literally line up to talk to me afterwards to tell me their stories. Since then, of course, that's what happens, every year when people do hundreds of productions of the show and thousands of productions of the show. But I think telling your story is the critical piece. Breaking the silence, moving it through the culture so that A, it did happen, B, your experience is real, and C, you're not alone. I mean, Trump keeps saying like it's all a conspiracy that these women are all coming out at the same time. No, Donald, you missed it. First of all, you denied it happened, which pissed a lot of women off. But second of all, when one woman gets courage to tell her story, she gives courage to everybody. And that's the thing we have to keep remembering. The bolder you are, the bolder your sister can be.
Well, and the thing that is actually, I don't know what's most appalling about Trump, but one of the things that just really has struck me is that when he's denying it not because it's not something he would do, but because she was too ugly.
Oh, exactly.
He would never get on that. I mean, how does that even help?
I think we're really clear about is that Donald Trump has no idea what misogyny is. Do you know what I mean? Like, he is a total and complete misogynist. He is so much so that he has no understanding that even when he's reacting to sexual assault, he's assaulting somebody. Like, everything's contained within the same gesture, which is what white privileged male looks like.
So in the 90s, when this wasn't something that was talked about so publicly, really until you brought it out to the surface, I mean, your story, you've experienced this firsthand, this violence at home. You grew up with it. You've been very public about that. What helped you talk about it for the first time ever publicly yourself?
Well, I think, looking at Donald Trump, to me, Donald Trump he's such a mythical daddy figure. And for those people who didn't grow up in an abusive home, he's still a mythical daddy figure. He's a person of great power. He's white. He has privilege. He's, to some people, charming. He's charismatic. He owns things. He dominates things. He sets the agenda. He determines who has value, who doesn't have value. Now, for me, growing up in a upper middle class family, white family, I mean, he's a mirror. I mean, my father wasn't as vulgar or vile in some ways as Donald Trump, but he was certainly as dominating, occupying, violating, do you know what I mean, in his own way. And I think, in a way, there came a point when I was doing this work where there was no way I could not talk about my own story. It would be disingenuous. You have to be part of the struggle, and your story is what unites you to the struggle. And I think when you tell your story, as I said before, it frees other people to tell you. It's not my shame. It's not my guilt. This isn't mine. It's my perpetrators, and I will not hold this guilt or shame. And we need to give it right back to these men who have abused us. It's not our story. It's our story, and that they have hurt us, but it's certainly not our shame or our responsibility. And every woman needs to know that. And that is the most deeply painful thing about sexual abuse and assault, is that you believe somehow it's your fault. you brought it on, you did something wrong, you caused it, and the opposite is the truth. It's your beauty, it's your intelligence, it's your gorgeous, sexual, powerful nature that actually some perpetrator and predator had no ability to resist. So it's on him. Everything about it is on him.
What's the best advice that you've ever been given about turning empathy into activism?
Well, I don't know that they're separate. I think activism is a energized form of empathy, right? It is acting because you feel the pain, the suffering, the oppression, the denigration in another person because you can't do but that.
I have one bonus question for you.
Okay.
What would the suffragettes say about their vaginas?
Vagina vote. Get your to the poll.
Wonderful. Eve, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
That was Eve Ensler. She's a playwright, a performer, and an activist, and she's determined to put an end to rape culture. Coming up after the break, I'll talk with Dr. Alison Dahl Crossley of Stanford's Clayman Institute for Gender Research.
Well, it says that certain men can get away with anything. More often than not, it feels like women are blamed for those sorts of situations rather than the man who's perpetrating it.
That's Dr. Alison Dahl Crossley talking about the Roger Ailes controversy. We'll hear more about that and her work studying feminism on college campuses. Dr. Crossley is the Associate Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford and has a book coming out called Finding Feminism, Millennial Activists and the Unfinished Gender Revolution. Welcome to the program, Alison.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What's going on college campuses these days with feminism?
There's a lot going on college campuses these days with feminism. And there's so many questions about, are young people interested in activism? Are they not? Do young women understand the inequalities that are around them? Do they not? And I think that when we look closely, we can see there's a lot of campus feminism happening. And it's really striking and important work that they're doing.
What motivated you to set out and go to 3 different types of campuses and really dig in to understand what is happening on campus?
Well, I was really frustrated in some ways because when you read about the feminist movement, there are so many contradictory messages about the state of it. If it's alive, if it's dead, and I don't expect there to be a unifying framework of everybody agreeing on the state of the movement. But there was so much speculation, and there is still so much speculation, but very little empirical data to really dig into those questions about what the state of the movement is among young people in particular. So I wanted to set out and ask some of those questions and think through what is the state of the movement for many young people today.
What were the different themes that you heard?
Well, in many ways, the young feminists who I spoke with continued the traditions of feminists of the past. So they were concerned with issues of sexual assault. They were concerned with the wage gap. They were concerned with reproductive rights. And we know that, unfortunately, those are many of the social ills that feminists have been working on for so long. They were also interested in the intersections of different inequalities. So the connections between racial and gender inequality, in the homophobia that they saw around them, or in the classism that they saw when they recognized that some of their peers couldn't afford to go to college. So there was also the interconnectedness of issues that was very important to them. And that is nothing really new in feminism. Women experience inequalities in so many different ways that feminism isn't inherently going to be really divergent by context and person. But that was really important to the students. And then the other part is that they changed feminism a lot in the sense that they did a lot of their organizing online and on social media. They were pushing the boundaries of some things. They were very interested in the inclusion of transgender people in the feminist movement. So overall, they continued many of the traditions of feminism, but I think reshaped some of them as well.
Were the young women that you talked to aware of what had come before them in terms of the feminist movement, or for them, were they experiencing it, these issues personally, and that this is the now, and we need to make change now, as opposed to thinking about where they were on the continuum of the feminist movement?
I was really surprised at what I found when I talked to young people about that in particular, because there was a lot of appreciation for what feminists of previous generations had gone through and what their victories. They knew that there have been many changes, dramatic changes in the past 30 years specifically, and they talked about them and were appreciative of them in many ways. So I didn't find a negativity at all. I found more of an appreciation, but also a sense of moving forward.
Did you talk to women and men?
It's interesting you asked that, because I started the study and I wanted to talk to both women and men, because I thought that, if there was a man who was a feminist who wanted to talk to me, I'd love that. And we talk a lot about how men should be included in the feminist movement and are in many ways. But men weren't very interested in participating in my research as much as I thought they might be. So really, although there were some men in the feminist organizations I did research with, I interviewed some men. It was really women who wanted to talk to me about feminism.
So you talk in the book about the Isla Vista murders at UC Santa Barbara. And I noticed that you went to UC Santa Barbara.
Yes.
That's one of your alma maters.
Mm-hmm.
Did it make it more personal for you having gone there?
Yeah, it certainly did. It really, I think it shook us all up, certainly, that it was such a tragedy and it was so shocking. And I think that I had that personal connection there. It drove it home a little bit, and especially seeing the feminists mobilize after it. And they got a lot of national attention, and those were many of the people who I knew when I was there, who were marching in the streets and, really drawing attention to the sexism that drove that horrible event.
Well, that is the interesting thing to me about that horrible event. I mean, it was a young man who had targeted these. He thought all the women at the college were against him, and he was going to get his revenge on them, right? So what is it about an act like that where you run into it being a sexist thing, a culture of misogyny, or a mental health issue, or a gun issue? I mean, how do you parse that? And why is something like that so necessary to get put a fire under the movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to disentangle because it's all of those things. But I think when moments like that happen, as tragic as they are, it really shows the number of people who are ready to go and mobilize and draw attention to the sexism that happened in that. I mean, the dialogue after that could have gone in many different ways, and it did. There were certainly people who were talking about gun violence after that, but I think the overwhelming narrative after that was about gender equality, and feminists really drove that discussion. So I think it draws attention to all the networks that are already in place to mobilize when needed. We might not see them all the time, but when those sorts of things happen, it really raises them up.
Do you have the sense that if we as a society were to achieve this nirvana of gender equality, that we would see violence against women drop?
Yes, absolutely.
It seems to make sense to me. But then I stop and think, but we still have violence. Men are still violent to men. Women, maybe on less occasion, are still violent to women.
Yeah.
So where do you see those two things intersecting? Equality and violence?
Well, I think that the power hierarchies and whose lives we value more than others, I mean, we can see that how it goes through the justice system, whose voices we listen to, whose experiences we value, what episodes draw national attention and what episodes don't. I mean, I think there's a really important connection there, and I don't think it would be a complete utopia, but I think many of the forms of gender inequality that we observe devolve into violence. And then after that, a lack of recognition of how it is then related to the gender power hierarchy. So kind of a circle there.
Let's talk about Roger Ailes for a moment. He was let go from Fox over sexual assault claims. He was paid all this severance. He's now advising a presidential candidate. Basically, he's getting away with what he did over the last 2 decades. We don't ever get to hear any specifics, but clearly it's bad enough that he's being paid millions of dollars to go away. What kind of message do you think this sends to the men and women in our country when something like this is allowed to happen?
Well, it says that certain men can get away with anything. It says that if you're in a certain position of power or domination, you can get away with a lot and you can abuse your power and certainly not feel the ramifications of it that I believe somebody should. I think it means that women's voices and experiences are not valued. It's another example of how in the dialogue around the Ailes controversy, it was asked more often, why did you stay, to those women, rather than why should they be working in such a hostile work environment. More often than not, it feels like women are blamed for those sorts of situations rather than the man who's perpetrating it. So I think it's really a reflection of a lot what we already know about gender inequality and sexism, and kind of a reminder of the ways in which it's perpetuated and the ways in which it's still here. I think it also is an opportunity to invite more men to stand up, to say, no, this isn't right, to stand up either against him if they're in the same company, or to stand up in solidarity with women who experience sexual harassment all around the world.
In spite of the ongoing feminist movement, there are still plenty of people who would consider themselves against it.
Yes.
Knowing that that's out there, and knowing that it's often accompanied by violence or internet trolls or any manner of things that could scare somebody who is vocal about being a feminist and is taking action around feminist issues. With all of that out there, what is your comfort level about being an outspoken feminist and speaking about the feminist movement?
I think it's just really important that in order to push against the status quo or create change, that's what you have to do, and you have to deal with the consequences. And I think it's important that that I am careful about making myself feel safe or protected or in the company of people that I love. But I think at the same time, it's got to be going out of your comfort zone a little bit, because feminism has always been about pushing that, and it's not going to come easy, and it never has. And feminists of all generations have always confronted negativity when they speak out. It's just how it goes when you try to make change. So I think it's expected.
I'm talking with Alison Crossley of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. I'm Lauren Schiller, and this is Inflection Point. I'm talking with Dr. Alison Crossley. She's got a book coming out this spring called Finding Feminism, Millennial Activists and the Unfinished Gender Revolution. What are you hoping will change as a result of publishing your book?
Well, what I really hope will change is acknowledgement that feminism is heterogeneous. It is not either alive or dead. It is complex and nuanced and situational dependent, context dependent. And that, I hope, will help us think through the various ways that people can be activists, the various ways people confront inequalities in their life, and really to highlight and amplify those. It might be that a woman doesn't have the opportunity to go march in the street or march on Washington or do a very public protest, but she might be really pushing back in her everyday life, creating change in her community and through her family and workplace. So I think also thinking about the varieties of ways that people approach change.
When you went to talk to the women at the 3 campuses that you went to, which, by the way, we should say what they were.
Yes, they were UC Santa Barbara, the University of Minnesota, and Smith College.
So two of those 3 you went to.
Correct, yes.
Why? Was that coincidence or what?
No, it wasn't coincidence. So I did have entree, and that was an important part of it. And I talked with my advisors and my peers a lot about this. I could have either chosen 3 schools that I had nothing to do with just because I had nothing to do with them. But what worked out about these schools is that they were in different parts of the country. They had different demographics, different activist cultures, and just totally different types of schools. And so it made for a really good comparative study.
I mean, what were some of the key findings?
Yeah, what was interesting is that there were some key themes that ran through the campuses, but there were really interesting differences. So, for example, UC Santa Barbara there's a high population of Latina students, and they were very active and organized, especially in their multicultural sororities. And they talked about how important it was to encourage their younger sisters or Latinas who were in high schools around UC Santa Barbara to come to the university. And that to them was a very important feminist mission to them. UC Santa Barbara is a very activist campus, and so that the feminists there felt very supported. And I saw feminism diffused into a lot of different types of organizations. At the University of Minnesota, there was a very strong feminist community, but it was a result of the fact that there were many adversaries who weren't so much of a fan of the feminist student organizations. So because they had to kind of fight for their resources and they had to stand up and talk about all the ways that feminism and activism was important, it caused them to have a really tight-knit community there. So that was an interesting finding, especially at the University of Minnesota. And at Smith College, they all sort of expected that they were feminists. So there was less of an urgency about the issues because they said, oh, this is a women's school. It has many feminist principles to it. So feminism didn't have such an immediacy, but it was assumed to be all around them. And that was frustrating to some of the activists there because there were still issues that they thought warranted attention from feminists on the campus, but everybody thought, oh, we're all on the same page. So they didn't have as much support as they would like, but they did do some organizing there as well.
So at Minnesota, where not everyone was on the same page, what does anyone have against feminism? I mean, if it's defined as equality, what is the problem?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Let's solve it right here.
The problem there, I think, was that those groups were funded by student service fees. And since the feminist organization was specifically a women's organization and all students paid into student service fees, men and women, some people objected to that. And also the feminists in the women's organization had very progressive views about things. They handed out condoms. They talked about sexuality. They cared about reproductive rights. So I think there was a sense that, hey, if I don't agree with that, why should some of my money go to that group? Most people, however, didn't worry so much about where every penny of their student service fees went, but there was a group of vocal people who objected to that.
Were you part of these feminist organizations when you were at Santa Barbara and at Smith?
When I was at Smith, I was, yes. I was involved in feminist organizations, and it was really important to me as a college student. And it was really helpful because as a student, you learn so much about inequality, and my eyes were really open to a lot of the injustices in the world. And sometimes you left the classroom depressed, frankly, learning about the world in a new way. And activism and being part of feminist groups was really empowering, both to confront many of these issues and to be with other people who felt like those issues were important.
When you came out of college, did you know that you wanted to continue being a feminist, studying feminism? I mean, it's your whole career now.
Yeah, absolutely. I did. I had that feeling.
And what are you, you're in a position now, you're at the Clayman Institute at Stanford. Mm-hmm. Where are you hoping that the research will take you and take Stanford and take our country, as you explore different facets of where feminism lives in our society?
Well, I think it's really exciting to think about the nexus of gender research and translating that gender research to general audiences. So to me, that is one of the imperatives of gender research, specifically in research around feminism, that it is in dialogue outside of the institution that that the research is conducted in, to really understand and be in conversation with broader communities about the findings of the research and how those findings might help us create change. And I think looking forward, there's a lot of promise in the future of gender research and a lot of energy and excitement. There has been for a really long time. It's not new, but I think now that there's more public attention to gender and feminism, it's a particularly exciting time to see where it might develop. I'm interested in thinking about the ways that online feminism continues to change, the ways that sexual assault is talked about on college campuses. I'm interested in thinking through sexual harassment and the implications of sexual harassment. Some of this research has been done already, but I think that it's time to maybe renew our attention to some of those topics.
So I can't have this conversation with someone from Stanford without bringing up the Brock Turner case and the sexual assault that he was convicted of and all of the outrage that came out around the length of his sentence. Where did the Clayman Institute fall into that conversation? Given everything that you study and stand for.
Well, what we're interested in at the Clayman Institute is thinking through the culture of sexual assault more broadly. So before that happened, we had already started an 18-month symposium called Breaking the Culture of Sexual Assault. So we had already been very involved with a number of different people on campus. There are a lot of people on campus who are interested in these issues, but we're looking at thinking about the different parts of society that perpetuate the culture of sexual assault. So we're looking at and thinking about and facilitating dialogues about how masculinity and dominant cultures of masculinity perpetuate sexual assault, or about the importance of the intersectional nature of understanding sexual assault. It's not just about women, it's about women and complex identities, and it's about men. So I think that we're a big part of the way that the campus is thinking through these issues. And I think that continues. We have men who are interested in talking about these issues on campus. We have some great researchers in our institute and undergraduates as well who are interested in continuing to change the way we talk about sexual assault on campus. So I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen, but I'm feeling that we're at a moment where people are really ready to talk about it and make some changes.
What's the best advice that you've ever been given about how to respond to someone who does not share your feminist point of view?
Stay calm. stay calm, I think, because oftentimes it's really difficult to have a discussion with somebody when you disagree so fundamentally about the principles of gender and gender inequality. And I think what I've learned along the way is to stay calm, to try to put myself in that person's shoes as much as possible and think if there could be a positive outcome of that conversation. Because I think when things get heated or agitated, nobody really learns from it.
Alison, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Alison Crossley, the Associate Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford. Look for her book this spring. It's called Finding Feminism, Millennial Activists and the Unfinished Gender Revolution. You may have noticed that in spite of all the talk about the possibility of the coming matriarchal dictatorship, men still hold the vast majority of corporate leadership and elected positions in America. And while that is slowly changing, it is still arguably a man's world. Humorist Blythe Roberson has some ideas to help us take over.
Hi, I'm Blythe Roberson, and here are everyday ways that I am fighting the patriarchy. If I ever feel bad about my body, I remember that it's my own fault because I didn't buy Dove body wash. When a guy told me he could never date a woman who used her relationships in her art, I tweeted about him 5,000 times. I bought the audiobook to the new Jonathan Safran Foer novel as soon as it came out, and I immediately smashed it with a hammer. I started a separate Instagram account for my own acne. I live every day extremely ready to run into Leonardo DiCaprio on the street and to scream at him about the beauty double standard. I threw a baby gender reveal party, but I filled my confetti poppers with sheets of paper that said, "Gender is a social construct." Also, I wasn't pregnant. Whenever two men are on screen together, I yell, "Kiss, kiss, kiss, kiss." I litter my conversations with references to Legally Blonde in order to make it more difficult for men to follow what I'm saying. I often wear two clashing floral prints. I say literally when I don't mean literally. When I doodle, I write my name with my crush's last name and my last name hyphenated. I never talk about baking, I never post on Instagram about baking, and I never bake. I do eat a lot of store-bought cookies. When I post my work online, I never say, "Here's a thing I made," but instead I say, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And finally, I am voting for Hillary Clinton.
Blythe Roberson is a contributor to The New Yorker, The Onion, and Clickhole, and a researcher for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. She also hosts a monthly show at Union Hall in Brooklyn. You can follow her on Twitter at BlytheLikeHappy. That's our inflection point for today. Is there a woman changing the status quo you'd like to hear from? Let us know at inflectionpointradio.org. And while you're there, I invite you to become a patron of Inflection Point, like the Perkins Fund, whose contributions are helping bring the voices and views of powerful women to the ears of everyone. And you can too at inflectionpointradio.org. Inflection Point is brought to you with the support of Girls Leadership, a national nonprofit teaching confidence-building skills that empower girls to make change in their world. We're on Facebook. Just search for Inflection Point Radio. Follow us, and follow me on Twitter at LA Schiller. And of course, visit us at our home base on the web, inflectionpointradio.org. Inflection Point is produced at the studios of KALW 91.7 FM in San Francisco, and delivered to public radio stations nationwide by PRX. Find our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and NPR One. And give us a review. We'd love that. Our engineer and producer is Eric Wayne. I'm your host, Lauren Schiller.